السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وبعد. Inshallah, today we're just going to have a brief introduction to the book. In fact, before we get to that, I just want to speak briefly about the author and his experience that led to writing this book. For those of you who have already read the work or have started reading it, you might be aware that Sheikh Hatim mentions basically in his introduction that he wrote this work based after having spent nearly 2 decades, or more than 2 decades now actually, well, at the time of writing the book, around 2 decades, having taught Tafsir. And so most of you are probably aware that Sheikh Hatim is, of course, well known as a hadith specialist. And while that is true, that is his area of specialization, is primarily hadith. He has also taught extensively all subjects related to tafsir in the university. And the reason for that, many of you might not be aware, but basically in al University, if you are interested in studying the hadith sciences, specializing in the hadith sciences, or interested in studying tafsir, specializing in tafsir, there is a department called Qism al-Kitabi wa Sunnah, Department of al-Kitab wa Sunnah. And so hadith studies and tafsir studies are combined in this department. So if you want to do a bachelor's degree, you would go to Department of al-Kitab wa Sunnah and do a bachelor's degree in al-Kitab wa Sunnah, which basically would be a mixed focus on hadith sciences and tafsir. If you go to other universities, for example, Medina University, you would choose one or the other. Either you would go to the hadith department and study a curriculum that focuses on hadith. Of course, there will be some tafsir and other subjects in there as well, but the focus will clearly be on hadith. Or you would go to the tafsir department, which is a separate department, and study a curriculum in which the focus is clearly on tafsir. But al has an approach that at the bachelor's level, you in that these two specialties are combined in a single department, and so the curriculum that you study in this department is a mix of both of these things together. The focus is on both of them without giving greater weight to one over the other. So Sheikh Hatim himself is a product of al University. He studied all of the various stages of his academic studies at al University, his bachelor's degree, master's, and PhD. And in the time when he had done the master's and PhD, the master's now, currently, if you do a master's or PhD in al University, after you've done your bachelor's in Kitab al-Sunnah or in some other field, and you choose to go for hadith or go for tafsir, you will have a choice between the hadith department and the tafsir department. So at the level of master's and PhD, these two specializations are in fact separate specializations. You pick one or the other. And if you do a master's in hadith, your PhD should also be in hadith. And if you do a master's in tafsir, then your PhD should also be in tafsir. However, when Sheikh Hatim had gone through the university, when he had gone through his higher studies, the categorization was not in this fact. It was not like this. It was still at master's level, a degree in Kitab al-Sunnah, and so the coursework portion of the master's would be a mix of tafsir courses or ulum al-Quran courses and hadith courses, and likewise at the PhD, which is the bulk of of masters and PhD is in Saudi Arabia in particular. Even for masters, the bulk of it is the thesis. So, but for the coursework portion, it would be a mix of both. So Sheikh Hatim did masters and PhD at a time when the categorization of the degree was that it was a master's in al-Kitab wa-Sunnah and a PhD in al-Kitab wa-Sunnah. So technically speaking, the degree was in both hadith and tafsir, even though his thesis, both at the master's level and at the PhD level, was focused on tafsir. But at that time, had he chosen, he could have done a master's in one and a PhD in the other, as opposed to the way the system is now. So in this old system, the teachers who were had a degree in al-Kitab wa-Sunnah were allowed to teach both the tafsir subjects as well as hadith subjects, because the degree was, the categorization of the degree was such that it covered both specializations, as opposed to those who have come after and have done the PhD either in tafsir or in hadith. They will be assigned specifically courses to teach that are according to their to the specialty that they have done, regardless of whether or not they're in fact, have the qualifications to teach the other subject or not. They will not be assigned those subjects. This is basically the way the system works. But Sheikh Hatim has in fact lengthy experience teaching tafsir. He has taught all of the tafsir and ulum al-Quran courses that are offered in the university over the years, over the course of 20 years. So he has extensive experience teaching the subject of tafsir as well as hadith. And the only reason I'm mentioning this is because, of course, I'm sure all of you are aware that Sheikh Hatim his reputation is as a hadith specialist, but he also has this extensive experience teaching tafsir, and also he has a couple of works that are tafsir related. Perhaps the most important of them is this book that he's written, تكوين ملكة التفسير. And as you can see, the title that we've given this course is How to Be a Mufassir. How to Be a Mufassir, or as the actual proper Arabic title of the book, تكوين ملكة التفسير خطوات علمية لتكوين ذهنية المفسر. So basically, if we were to translate the title literally, it is, developing the aptitude, developing the skill set of a mufassir. Skill set to do tafsir. Not reading tafsir, not understanding what you're reading, but developing the ability to do tafsir for yourself. So this book attempts to lay out a program that the student can follow in order to develop this ability. And so if we just take a look, الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على إمام الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى أزواجه أمهات المؤمنين وعلى ذريته إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد، فلا يشك ناصح لأمته أن سبيل نهضتها منوط بأمور من أجلها وأهمها أن نعيد إلى العلوم الإسلامية هويتها وعمقها وأثرها في حياة الناس. وهذه الغاية الغالية العالية تستوجب جهودا جبارة في تجديد هذه العلوم، التجديد الذي يعيدها إلى ما كانت عليه في زمن سلفنا الصالح وخير القرون، من خلال التجديد لمناهج التعلم والتعليم وتخير المناهج التي تورث علما حقيقيا وفقها عميقا وإيمانا تزكو به النفوس. وقد رغبت أن أسهم في ذلك بطرح خطة عملية تحقق بإذن الله تعالى تكوين ملكة علمية لأحد أجل العلوم وهو علم التفسير. Here Sheikh Hatim explains what he means by الملكة التفسيرية or ملكة التفسير. ومرادي بالملكة التفسيرية التأهل العلمي والذهني لإدراك الفهم الصحيح للآية بالاجتهاد المبني على أدلته لا تقليدا. So it is qualifying the person academically, meaning that he has the requisite knowledge base as well as the critical mindset to be able to arrive at the correct understanding of the verse based on ijtihad that is based on evidence rather than taqleed. And so in explaining with the meaning of malakah, in the footnotes, you'll see he has some references that is given. الملكة صفة راسخة في النفس تحصل بتكرار وممارسة. Malakah, basically having an aptitude for any or skill for anything, basically is something that it's something that is attained by experience, something that is attained by practice. As they say, practice makes perfect. So it's something that you have to practice. And he quotes Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun says, وذلك أن الحذق في العلم واليقين فيه والاستيلاء عليه إنما هو بحصول ملكة في الإحاطة بمبادئه وقواعده والوقوف على مسائله واستنباط فروعه من أصوله. وما لم تحصل هذه الملكة لم يكن الحذق في ذلك الفن حاصلا. وهذه الملكة هي غير الفهم والوعي، لأن نجد فهم المسألة الواحدة من الفن الواحد مشتركا بين من شدا في ذلك الفن ومن هو مبتدئ فيه، وبين العامي الذي لم يحصل علما وبين العالم النحرير. والملكة إنما هي للعالم والشادي في الفنون دون من سواهما، فدل على أن هذه الملكة غير الفهم. So Ibn Khaldun, he says that expertise in knowledge or in a science, in a particular science, and having certainty in your understanding of it and mastery of it can only be achieved by developing a malakah, by developing the aptitude that allows you, a skill that allows you to comprehensively understand its fundamentals, its principles, to discover its masail, its issues, and to be able to deduce its details from its fundamentals, the furu' from the usul. وما لم تحصل هذه الملكة لم يكن الحذق في ذلك الفن حاصلا. As long as you don't have that aptitude, as long as you don't have that ability to do these things, then in reality you've not attained true mastery of that discipline. And this skill, this aptitude in whatever discipline you may be seeking to master, is not the same as simply knowing and understanding the information. غير الفهم والوعي، لأن نجد فهم المسألة الواحدة من الفن الواحد مشتركا بين من شدا في ذلك الفن ومن هو مبتدئ فيه، وبين العامي الذي لم يحصل علما وبين العالم النحرير. So it says that that when it comes to individual issues, we find that an individual issue, in our case, we'll take tafsir, the interpretation of a particular verse, will be known to someone who is engaged in that science and the one who is a beginner studying that science, and even the ammi who's not studied that science, as well as the scholar who is a master of the science. So any given piece of information, any given interpretation of a given verse, any of these people can know it and be aware and understand that, okay, that this is the interpretation of this verse. But the malakah will only belong to the person who's the scholar or the person who has been engaged in that discipline for a considerable time, to the exclusion of all others. So because malakah takes time to develop, takes practice, it takes experience to develop, and it takes an ability to critically engage with what you are studying or with the discipline that you are engaging with. في موطن آخر فرق ابن خلدون بين معرفة قوانين العلم وملكته، فأقد فصلا بعنوان في أن هذا اللسان غير صناعة العربية مستغنية عنها في التعليم، ثم قال: والسبب في ذلك أن صناعة العربية إنما هي معرفة قوانين هذه الملكة ومقاييسها خاصة، فهو علم بكيفية، فليست هي الملكة، وإنما هي بمثابة من يعرف صناعة من الصناعة علما ولا يحكمها عملا. وهكذا هو العلم بقوانين الإعراب، إنما هو علم بكيفية العلم وليس هو نفس العلم. ولذلك نجد كثيرا من جهابذة النحاة والمهرة في صناعة العربية المحيطين علما بتلك القوانين، إذ سئل في كتاب سطرين إلى أخيه أو ذي مودته وشكوى ظلامة أو قصد من قصوده أخطأ فيه الصواب وأكثر من اللحن، إلى آخر كلامه البديع المفيد. Ibn Khaldun, in his Muqaddimah, was speaking about Arabic grammar. Was speaking about the study of the Arabic language and Arabic grammar in particular. Says that knowing the rules of grammar, the rules of Arab, is not the same as having mastery of it. In fact, it's not even necessary that to attain mastery you have to have formally studied these rules, because obviously the Arabs who used the language before these rules were developed had mastery of it. And you could have some, and then he mentions the example. This is in fact something that is mentioned sometimes in the biographies of some of the early Nuhat, that while they had mastered the theoretical study of grammar, when it came time to write, they weren't actually very proficient in their grammar because of not having actually used it. So when it came time for them to write, they would still make grammatical mistakes. Now, if you gave them a verse of Quran and asked them to analyze it grammatically and what are the grammatical features that are present in it, if you gave them a qasida and asked them, to analyze what are the grammatical features that are present in it, they would do that. But they didn't necessarily have the skill of putting those grammatical features into use because they hadn't been using them. And that comes from the fact that, as many of you will be aware, that in considerable part that spoken Arabic is not like spoken Arabic is not like the classical Arabic. In spoken Arabic, many of the features, many of the grammatical features, have fallen out of use. The Arab, the actual grammatical endings, are largely have fallen out of use, and this is from an early time because of the Arabs mixing with non-Arabs. Many of these features they went out of use in daily speech. So he uses the Sheikh Hatim has quoted this as an example of the difference between having knowledge of something and having the ability to actually apply it. That they're not necessarily the same, as Ibn Khaldun explains here. And this is something that you may have experienced even yourselves. You might study grammar, Arabic grammar. In fact, you might study it to its considerable, to considerably advanced stage and in considerable detail, and master the theoretical study of it, and yet struggle to speak Arabic. Some of you might have actually had this experience in your study of the Arabic language. And the reason is because this formal and theoretical study is certainly useful in various respects. It's useful. Developing the ability to speak grammatically correct Arabic beyond studying the grammar rules. In fact, to a considerable extent, to be able to speak good proper Arabic, you probably don't actually need to know a whole lot of the rules. Meaning, there's a significant number of the rules that if you knew them, you would probably be able to speak. If you knew them and then started applying them, you would be able to speak generally grammatically correct Arabic. And so a lot of the details that you're going to be studying in more advanced texts of Arabic grammar, they might be useful for other purposes, but for the purpose of developing the ability to speak properly, they actually become superfluous. So they become unnecessary. Because at that point you need to actually work on practicing. So there are skills that that require practice. I mean, if you take, for example, as another example, driving a car, and I think any of you who drive a car, which I assume probably majority of you drive. That while you can study sort of on a theoretical level how to drive, learn all the rules, and best practice and what have you, that at the end of the day, driving really comes down to getting behind the wheel and practicing. No matter how much you study at the theoretical level, if you haven't practiced, then you don't actually have that skill that you've read about the skill. You might understand the theoretical components of that skill better than a lot of people who are actually very good drivers. In fact, a lot of people might have learned about driving or read about some of the rules and regulations of driving when they're first learning, or guidelines about best practice in driving. They might have learned about them when they were first learning, and have since forgotten whatever it is they've read. But if you haven't driven a car, if you haven't practiced driving, you won't be able to drive. And the solution is not then to just study bigger and bigger books on driving. It's start practicing driving, because it's a practical skill. Obviously, the analogy doesn't work so well because I'm not suggesting that to become a Mufassir that the deeper theoretical study is not important or necessary. I mean, this is different in that respect, but I think you can appreciate here what is the difference between simply having some information, maybe even understanding that information, and then actually being able to use that information. Of course, there are other aspects to this analogy as well that perhaps don't work, but nonetheless, So then Sheikh Hatim, he goes on to mention a very interesting quote from Imam al-Ghazali. And this quote is in fact, what is sort of the basis of this book, that Sheikh Hatim is building the idea of this book from this idea that is mentioned here by Imam al-Ghazali. So he says وقد تكلم الأصوليون في شروط المجتهد عن أنه لا يشترط في تكوين ملكته أن يكون عالما بتفاريع الفقه. فقال الغزالي: فأما الكلام وتفاريع الفقه فلا حاجة إليهما. Okay, so now Imam al-Ghazali is specifically talking about the shurut of the mujtahid. What are the qualities that someone needs to attain ijtihad? And so tafari' al-fiqh, he means the masail of fiqh, knowing the details of fiqh, the details of the rulings of each and every mas'ala. Is this necessary for a person to be mujtahid? Knowing these rulings, is it a precondition for ijtihad? It says وكيف يحتاج إلى تفاريع الفقه. How could knowledge of these rulings be a precursor to ijtihad? وهذه التفاريع يولدها المجتهدون, when the fact of the matter is that these rulings were derived by mujtahidun in the first place. ويحكمون فيها بعد حيازة منصب الاجتهاد, and they derived these rulings, they gave their judgments concerning these issues only after having attained the rank of ijtihad. فكيف تكون شرطا في منصب الاجتهاد. So if it's something that only occurred after they attained ijtihad, how can it be a requirement before ijtihad? فكيف تكون شرطا في منصب الاجتهاد وتقديم الاجتهاد عليها شرط. Ijtihad has to happen before you can have these rulings in the first place. نعم. So then he says, okay, what can be said, إنما يحصل منصب الاجتهاد في زماننا بممارسته، فهو طريق تحصيل الدربة في هذا الزمان، ولم يكن الطريق في زمن الصحابة ذلك، ويمكن الآن سلوك طريق الصحابة أيضا. So this is a very interesting statement from Imam al-Ghazali. It says that in practical terms, in our times, ijtihad is only attained by actual study of fiqh. Study of these tafari' that we're saying are cannot be a prerequisite because they're the product of ijtihad. So he says فهو طريق تحصيل الدربة في هذا الزمان. So the way to practice ijtihad in our time, the way to develop ijtihad in our time, is to actually study the books of fiqh, because obviously by his time that he's speaking about, the four madhahib are fairly well developed. I mean, if we consider the works that he himself has written as an indication of how much fiqh has developed, he has his own works in the Shafi madhab, al-Wajiz, al-Wasit, and al-Basit. Al-Basit is as of yet unpublished. Parts of it have been edited as Rasail in various universities, but the work is as of yet unpublished. But it's a very large work. If you look at his al-Wasit is published with some of its hawashi in 7 volumes. And al-Basit is maybe double its size. And al-Basit itself is based on Nihayat al-Matlab of his teacher, Imam al-Haramain Abu al-Ma'ali al-Juwaini, which is published in 19 volumes. And if you consider Nihayat al-Matlab, a book of that size, you might expect that, okay, this is a book on comparative fiqh. Whereas in reality, it's just a book on the furu' of the Shafi'iyya. It's just a book on the furu' of the Shafi'iyya. And he only mentions opinions from the other madhahib when comparison of the ruling of the Shafi'i madhab with the rulings of the other madhahib are useful for him to explain the reasoning underlying the how the masail in his own madhab work. So it only happens when he mentions other madhahib, he mentions opinions in other madhahib, he only does so incidentally. It's not his purpose. And so these works, they're entirely devoted just to the madhab. So you can imagine, if you add to that, the works that have been written in the Hanafi madhab, in the Maliki madhab, in the Hanbali madhab, that fiqh by this time is quite, there's a tremendous amount of detail out there. It's a very developed field. It says that in practical terms, in our times, the way to attain ijtihad is by studying these books of fiqh. That is how it's done. It says, وَلَمْ يَكُنِ الطَّرِيقِ فِي زَمْنِ الصَّحَابَةِ ذَلِكَ. But in the time of the Sahaba, that wasn't the case. The Sahaba became mujtahids, right? But did they have books of fiqh to study? Did Umar ibn al-Khattab reading al-Mughni? Was Ibn Abbas was reading Nihayat al-Matlab of al-Juwayni or al-Hawi or al-Mardawi or sorry, of al-Mawardi, or they didn't have any of these works. Does that mean that they weren't mujtahids? So clearly, then attaining ijtihad is not dependent on this, even if in practical terms that might be the most practical method for attaining ijtihad. So it says this wasn't the path for attaining ijtihad in the time of the Sahaba. Then he goes on to say, وَيُمْكِنُ الْآنْ سُلُوكُ طَرِيقِ الصَّحَابَةِ أَيْضًا. But the path of the Sahaba for attaining ijtihad is still possible today, in his time, meaning after the madhahib were established. Now, if we consider, what was the ijtihad of the Sahaba? The Sahaba, of course, they knew the Quran, and they had spent time with the Prophet ﷺ and heard his statements, and then some of his statements that they had not heard from the Prophet ﷺ, they learned them from others. And so they had basically in front of them the Quran, and they had the statements and teachings and practice of the Prophet ﷺ, and they would derive rulings from those. And so, ijtihad, if we consider ijtihad in terms of istinbat, of deriving the ruling for yourself in the first place, basically when you're starting with a clean slate, is not the same as ijtihad when you have in front of you that, okay, there are these many opinions. Umar says such and such, Ibn Umar says such and such, Aisha says such and such, Fulan says such and such, Imam Shafi's opinion is so, Imam Abu Hanifa's opinion is like so, and so forth. When you have those opinions in front of you, and you have many of the arguments for those opinions in front of you, you can study them, you can analyze them. But that analysis is not going to be the same as trying to go through the process of looking at the text and figuring out what possible meanings can be taken from this text, what possible rulings can be taken from this text. And when I say taking meanings from the text, I don't just mean textual interpretation, but then you also have qiyas, where you're looking at various texts of the Sharia, trying to discover what is the illah underlying a hukum, and then based on that extending ahkam, but keeping in mind that you're not contradicting other ahkam, you're not contradicting other texts, and so forth. So obviously this process of ijtihad, that is ijtihad of istinbat, where you're looking basically at the texts as sort of raw material and deriving the ruling for yourself, is not the same as someone coming along later and saying simply having the text in front of him. Sorry, not just having the text in front of him, but having all of the opinions in front of him and looking at the opinions. Even if he looks at the opinions, even if he analyzes the evidences for those opinions, the work that he has done is still not comparable to the work of the original Imam of Ijtihad. So what does Imam al-Ghazali mean when he says يمكن الآن سلوك طريق الصحابة أيضا? Is he saying that, let's throw out the books of fiqh and reinvent the wheel? I think, given his status as a Shafi'i faqih, with these voluminous works that he's written on the Shafi'i madhab, and it's not just al-Wajiz, al-Wasit, and al-Basit. Those are his books that he's written about furu'. Then he has other works that he's written about that deal with fiqh al-khilaf, one of which has recently been published, called Tahsin al-Ma'akhidh, in 4 volumes. And apparently this is actually his medium-sized work on this topic. Apparently he had a longer work on this topic. So he is a scholar who's written volumes upon volumes about fiqh, as well as having written extensively about usul al-fiqh. Of course, we have his al-Mustasfa and we have his al-Mankhul, and then he had a work, I think he refers to it as Tahdhib al-Usul, which is larger than al-Mustasfa, which has not reached us. So clearly he's not suggesting that we should take all of this work that the mujtahids have developed and throw it out the window and start from zero. But what he is talking about here is how to develop the quality of ijtihad. How to develop the quality of ijtihad. In terms of how to develop the quality of ijtihad, you could still go through the practice of examining the texts and attempting to interpret them for yourself. Again, this is why the purpose of doing this is not to reinvent the wheel. The purpose is not to say, we know better than the fuqaha, we know better than the imam of all the ages that have spoken about this issue. But the purpose is to develop the ability to do so. It is only with the ability to do so that your conclusion on any matter will genuinely have weight. Because if you don't have the skill to do it, then your conclusion will not be your conclusions on when you are forced to do ijtihad, or when you do choose to do ijtihad, your conclusions will not be very sound, because you actually don't have the skills for what you are attempting to do. And so and of course, as he says, that skill can be developed in this way, and it can be developed by spending a long time reading and studying and critically analyzing the works of fiqh. But also it can be done in this fashion, that you go back to the texts, you look at them, and you attempt to analyze them and attempt to determine what could be the possible ruling. So this works and this works. And this has its role and this has its role. Well, I mean, I don't know if he's necessarily saying that this has its role or this has its role, but he is saying that this is possible. So the program that Sheikh Hatim has laid out in this book is based on, and to a large extent, it is based on the idea that Imam al-Ghazali has laid out here, that there is it is possible to attain ijtihad by going direct to the texts and analyzing them and applying to them the different skill sets that are needed for that sort of analysis, and then honing those skills by a sort of a directed practice, directed application. So that's why what Shaykh Hatim actually suggested here is that basically, to give you the gist of the program that he's laid out here, the idea is take a section of the Quran, maybe half a juz, maybe a juz, two ajza, whatever the case may be, but take a section of the Quran, ideally a section of the Quran that you have not studied the tafsir of. Either you've not studied it at all, or if you've studied tafsir of the whole Quran, a section of the Quran that in terms of your knowledge of its tafsir, you don't know it that well, or at least you don't know it as well as you know other sections of the Quran. So choose a section of the Quran that you don't know that well, you haven't studied that in depth. Maybe if you studied it, it's been a long time, and so it's not very fresh for you. So you're basically, the idea is that you're trying to select a portion of the Quran to practice your skill on, to practice developing your skills on, that is more or less sort of a blank slate for you. And so he takes the reader through a series of steps. The purpose of these steps is to apply every skill set that you could possibly need as Mufassir. And so he lays out these skill sets in a series of steps that you can apply going through the surah. So let's say for the sake of argument that you choose Surah Al-Qasas or whatever the case may be. So you start reading Surah Al-Qasas, pondering Surah Al-Qasas, attempting to just from your reading and contemplation to try and determine what does Surah Al-Qasas mean. Then you go through certain steps using certain tools in certain fashion as he's laid out to then build on your initial reading, and along the way, as you attempt to apply different aspects of tafsir, different skill sets that are necessary, that are a component of tafsir, as you attempt to apply them, when you come to the end of that step, you want to go back and then compare with works of the Mufassirin, various sources, to try and identify where the gaps in your understanding, and then by so doing, discovering where are those gaps, what are the errors that you've made, and how to, so then working on those gaps, working on addressing those errors, understanding why you fell into an error so that you don't fall into the same error again. And so in this fashion, you're making this ijtihad. And this ijtihad, the purpose of this ijtihad is not to go out to the world and then publish a tafsir and say that this is my tafsir of Surah Al-Qasas or tafsir of what have you, because this is a practice run. This is a practice run. And so it's natural that you're going to make mistakes. Don't be afraid of making mistakes. You're not saying that this is what the surah means. You're not making tafsir of the surah and and putting that out there and publishing it. So you're not, this would not fall under al-qawl ala Allah bighayri ilm. But the purpose of this practice is to try and understand deeper how to do tafsir. And so eventually, as you're comparing what you have said with what the Mufassirin have said, you'll discover your errors. And in the course of discovering your errors and comparing what the Mufassirin have said and attempting to understand why you erred, and then if you got something right, just attempting to understand what it is that you did right, you will develop an appreciation and understanding for how the actual Imam of Tafsir, how they did Tafsir. Because you're going through the same process that they had to go through. So this basically is the gist of the idea of Sheikh Hatim's program for how to develop the malakah of Mufassir, how to develop the skill and aptitude necessary to do tafsir. So it should be said, when it comes to how tafsir is typically studied and how it's typically taught in traditional seminaries, tafsir is typically taught in a fashion that relies typically just on reading a certain text, whatever that assigned text may be, whether it's Tafsir al-Jalalain, Tafsir al-Baydawi, or the Tafsir al-Kathir, or some modern work, or some other classical work. So you're simply going through this work and reading what the author has to say. And so you're simply learning what that author has to say. So you're learning the interpretations, but the thought process that goes into deriving those interpretations is not necessarily being explored. And unfortunately, what happens is too often that when tafsir is taught, that there's not much focus on critical analysis of what is being taught. And so it simply becomes that this is what we learned in class, that this verse means this, and or it has this many interpretations, so therefore that's simply what it is, as opposed to understanding, well, how did these ulama arrive at these interpretations? How did this scholar arrive at this conclusion that this interpretation is a stronger opinion? Or some of the interpretations that are mentioned, how in the world did he even determine that this is a possible interpretation of this verse? So or whoever that he happens to be quoting this opinion from. So and when that does happen, when this type of analysis does happen, unfortunately many times it's too this usage of this approach is too far and few in between, that it's not being used extensively enough to really develop those skills. It's not being used extensively enough to appreciate all of the skills and bring to bear in tafsir all of the skills that one would need as a mufassir. And so this problem, Sheikh Hatim, as I mentioned before, as I began, I said that he has this 20 years of experience teaching tafsir. It's actually more than that now, but at the time of writing this this book, initially, when he initially published it, it's been about 12 years, 13 years since he initially published it. It's been it's been more than that, but at that time it's been 20 years. And Sheikh Hatim himself, in his experience with teaching tafsir, he would focus on bringing many of these skill sets into the classroom and trying to get the students to apply it for themselves. And so, encouraging them to try and interpret the text as raw text and arrive at different understandings. And so what he found from experience was that and obviously this is being done in this case under the direction of a teacher, which is good, and which is something that is perhaps a teacher can, an experienced, skilled teacher can help guide students through this process. That sometimes what you would find is that as the discussions in class would proceed, and some students would mention an interpretation, and other students would mention an interpretation, that, and this is based on simply them attempting to look at the verses and discuss what they mean, and walk and sort of think through what it possibly could mean, and how it fits in with the siyaq, and what are the possible dilalat of the individual words, and how they fit into the tarkib, and so forth. That that one student is actually putting forth an interpretation that has been mentioned by the Mufassirin, and another student is putting forth a different interpretation that has also been mentioned by some Mufassirin. And so by allowing them to go through this process and then pointing out, this what you've said here, this is actually, this particular interpretation. This is what you've said here, this is actually this particular interpretation. It allows the student to gain an appreciation for, okay, this is how tafsir is done. So in a more limited scope, Sheikh Hatim attempted in his teaching of the subject to bring in a certain level of critical thinking and development of actual skills, rather than simply, I'm going to tell you what these verses mean, and the strongest opinion is this, and the next verse, there's these opinions, and it's like this until we get to the end. Because you can do that, but to a considerable extent, after a certain point, any student can go and just read those opinions for himself and say that, yeah, these are the opinions that have been mentioned. And so you're just at that point, it just becomes a sort of process of regurgitating what has been said without a great deal of analysis. And even if the teacher himself has engaged in a considerable degree of analysis to arrive at a certain conclusion, the student is not necessarily getting the benefit of that if the teacher has not allowed him to share in that process of analysis, to have a role, even if it's a limited role, even if it's just for the sake of practice, just as an exercise in the classroom. And so the teacher might have done that, but the student is nowhere closer. At the end of the class, the student, at the end of the semester, at the end of the course, the student is not necessarily any closer to developing that analytical skill set than he was at the beginning. Yes, he has acquired new information, ideally, that's if he's able to remember it. Another problem is that the sort of passive reception of information that is being thrown at you is, in and of itself, it's not actually an excellent method for learning, because a lot of it is not going to stick with you. It's just going to be after the exam, it will be gone, as opposed to the person who has spent time reading and thinking through the problems and has made them his own questions and has made an attempt to get to the bottom of answering them. Then the information even tends to stick. Just as a point about acquisition of information, it tends to stick better in this fashion. It tends to stick better in this fashion. But that ideally in the process of teaching should involve including the student in that analytical thought process, helping him develop the ability to engage in that sort of analytical thought process. And this applies, of course, to tafsir, and applies to generally any other science, that ideally you want the students to engage with it in this fashion. And it's not simply an information dump. It's not simply an information dump that you come to the lecture and the teacher dumps on you a certain amount of information, and then you simply internalize that information without a considerable degree of critical thought or analysis. So Shaykh Hatim had this experience with teaching, and he had attempted to bring this approach sort of into the classroom, and based on this type of thinking, to develop the skills of the students. And so based on this long time spent teaching, and also this sort of inspired by this point mentioned by Imam al-Ghazali. I'm not sure if that was a direct inspiration for this project, but certainly you can see how what Imam al-Ghazali has mentioned here was how it played into what Shaykh Hatim was attempting to do. So he set out to create this program, and there's actually an interesting story about how he did so. Because as he was trying to think through what are the ideal steps to achieve what he set out for as the goal for this program, he found himself having to make significant changes to it again and again and again. And back in those days, he used to actually write out his books by hand. He was not very experienced with computers. Even until some time back, the computers were not necessarily as friendly for Arabic-speaking users. Obviously, things have advanced considerably since then. He had made an attempt at one point to get a computer and learn to start using it, but it just not been very successful. And so, this was in fact, I think, the last of his works that he wrote out by hand. He ended up having to rewrite the whole thing because he was significantly rearranging things, and as he was developing his ideas, he ended up rewriting the whole thing 7 times, and got pretty frustrated because every time he needed to rearrange the steps, he had to rewrite everything, because he was having to make very significant changes. And so he ended up sort of rewriting the whole thing about 7 times. And so it was around then that he actually really sort of bit the bullet and started learning slowly to use a computer. And finally he actually wrote out this book on the computer, because that made it much easier than when he had to make these significant changes, that he was able to do so with a minimum of pain. And so since then, all the works that he's written since then he's actually done with the computer, on Microsoft Word. And so in his books that he's done since then, anytime he wants to make changes or he wants to add things, it's very easy for him to simply go back to the Word file and to correct typographical errors, to add sections, to add discussions, and to expand on his work, so that for second editions, that it's relatively painless, the process of editing. I mean, so much so that at one point he used to give fatwas for the fatwa section of the website Islam al-Yawm, Islam Today, islamtoday.com. And before he had started using the computer, the questions that they would send him that he would write answers for, he would write them out by hand and he would fax it to them. And one time he had written a long answer on some question or another. I think it was to do with, it was called, it was published under the title al-Jawab an-Tu'un fi Sahih al-Bukhari. It's a lengthy fatwa. I think it was like maybe 20 pages or something like that, responding to criticisms on Sahih al-Bukhari. And when he sent it to them and then they typed it up, there were some errors, because in the process of typing up his written answer that he had faxed to them, there were some errors that crept into the text, and so he highlighted them and he added a comment here saying that this needs to be changed in such and such fashion. When they eventually published it, that comment that he had put in, whoever was doing it didn't understand, and they actually included the comment that this is wrong and this needs to be changed. They actually included it in the text of the fatwa. So this had been his experience with writing. I've actually seen in his library research papers that he'd written back before he'd been using the computer, where he has files literally this big, hundreds of pages, that he has written by hand, going through various issues that he's written about, that he was researching. So this had been his experience before. Alhamdulillah, with the usage of this technology, this made things much easier. But this is basically the story behind the writing of this book, and it's an interesting story, so I thought I would share. But it reflects the amount of thought that Sheikh Hatim put into thinking through the ideal steps, the ideal program. And so that was something that he wrote it out. He eventually published it. It was published as a research paper in Majallat Ma'had al-Imam al-Shatibi, the Ulum al-Quran al-Kareem originally, and then it was published separately. Then years later, he gave a talk on the importance of tajdeed and tafsir, which developed into the new first half of this book. So basically, the original paper that he had written is it is now just half. It is the second half of the book. So basically, until page 59. Until page 59 is the new section that is now the first half of the book, about tajdeed and tafsir. Tajdeed and tafsir. And then the second half of the book basically is actually laying out his program. His actual program with the delineated steps for how to develop the skills of tafsir. So the original work that he had originally published was that second half, basically. And this first half of the book that is devoted to tajdeed and tafsir is new, and basically this print that you see here, this is the print of, I don't know if you can see that clearly. Okay, I guess Markaz Nama. Well, it's on the cover. Hold on. This print from Markaz Nama is the print that includes this first half. So some of you may have actually a physical copy of the book or of his original research paper, which would be missing this part of the book. Obviously, this is available on PDF. If you Google it, you'll find it. It's on Sheikh Hatim's website. Legacy has put it up on the Telegram channel as well. But this edition is the sort of the final edition of the book that has the second part. And the reason that he added the second part about the need for tajdeed and tafsir was basically as a sort of an answer to an objection that someone might say, well, the job of explaining the Quran is done. In which case, what's the point in attempting to develop malakah for tafsir, right? I mean, if the Quran has already been explained, the Imam have explained it, and we've inherited those explanations. There's no need for someone to go to all this trouble in attempting, to implement this program that you've laid out. So, in order to address that question, he talks about: is there a need for tajdeed in tafsir? What does it mean, tajdeed in tafsir? What are the different types of tajdeed in tafsir that are needed? Because if we speak about tajdeed in tafsir in its different facets, then that requires people who have the actual malakah to do tafsir. One thing that I would add is that even if we say that the commentaries on the Quran are sufficient, the commentaries that have been written in the past are sufficient. There's so many of them. They're so rich. They're so diverse. They're sufficient. That might very well be so, but isn't it the case that in our times we have people who are interpreting the Quran that are not qualified, people who are interpreting the Quran with methodologies that they have invented? And so if you want to critically engage them and show that their methodology is wrong, their conclusions are fundamentally wrong, if you don't have this malakah, if you're not basically a mujtahid in tafsir, essentially your answer will be that they're wrong because this is not what the Salaf have said. They're wrong because this is not what the Mufassirin have said. And so intellectually, what they're saying might be complete another bakwas, might be nonsense, but they would still be able to dance circles around you because your only response would your only recourse would be to say that, well, nobody said this. And so if he responds, well, they're wrong, and this is why they're wrong, X, Y, Z, and what? But who are you? If these types of people, you'll find that certainly if you're going to convince them or convince their followers, you're going to have to be able to engage with the ideas in a more critical fashion, and so that requires someone who has a degree of ijtihad in tafsir. So in any case, this basically brings us to the end of our introduction to the book. From next week, we will start looking into this first half of the book, dealing with what is tajdeed in tafsir, the types of tajdeed that are needed as a precursor for as a necessary requisite to establish that there is in fact benefit in scholars developing the malakah for tafsir today, and then we will move on in subsequent sessions to looking at the actual program that Sheikh Hatim has laid out, and I'll try and dig out some examples to illustrate points to help get a better idea of the steps that Sheikh Hatim has laid out in his program. So inshallah, we'll conclude with that. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.